Good evening. Mic's on. Good evening. I'm Bobby Bolin. I am a passionate volunteer for the South Dakota Humanities Council and a cheerleader for all of the folks that are here this evening. I am also the board chair for the South Dakota Humanities Council, so it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight to this premier event, the South Dakota Festival of Books. First of all, we would like to acknowledge first and foremost that we stand on the sacred ground of the Oshiti Shekawan, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. We honor and appreciate the indigenous people who have the longest relationship with this place. Before we begin tonight, we have a few thank yous to do. One of those to the Oscar Performing Arts Center for hosting us for all of these events. Thank you to those. Thank you to them for having us here. And I would also like, first and foremost, to thank the staff. They have done an extraordinary job. If you have had interaction with them, Jennifer Woodman, Carolyn Marshall, Stacy, Deb, please stand up. Thank you. Melinda, thank you so much. They are operating short staffed, and we are working with volunteers. So if you have volunteered here, thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts, because it means everything. So if you are a volunteer, thank you. You can also provide us feedback for this year's event so that we can get better, because we strive every year to do a better job. There is an online survey that is available for you to take to keep us posted in how we are doing, and we appreciate all of those who fill it out. So thank you. You can also help to keep this festival free by making a tax-deductible donation to the South Dakota Humanities Council. To donate, visit southdakotahumanities.org or use one of those slips available. You can enter our drawing for a print of the festival cover image by the image is by Brookings artist Chuck Bennis. Donate $50 for your first entry and $10 after that. This festival would not be possible without the generous support of the numerous organizations and individuals who have donated and are acknowledged on the back cover of the festival guide. Thank you to all of those organizations. And if there's anyone in the room who is part of those organizations, would you please stand? We would like to acknowledge you. Thank you. And now we're very fortunate to have a special guest here with us to help us present this year's Distinguished Achievement in the Humanities Awards. He's here all the way from Washington, D.C. He has become a somewhat of a regular visitor, and we are very appreciative. Anthony Tony Mitchell serves as the Senior Deputy Chief at the National Endowment for the Humanities. Mitchell previously served for 14 years as NEH Chief Human Capital Officer and Director of the Office of Human Resources. From March 2021 through June 2022, he oversaw the agency's administrative offices as acting assistant chair for planning and operations. Before joining NEH, Mitchell held senior leadership positions at the Transportation Security Administration, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Election Commission. Mitchell began his career at the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2006, Mitchell started the ELF Project, a nonprofit organization that supports the students of Turner Elementary School in Washington, D.C. In his spare time, he enjoys running, distance swimming, and live theater. So please help me give him a South Dakota welcome, Tony Mitchell.
I don't even I don't even get that kind of welcome in Washington D.C. So thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be here this evening. And before I start, I just want to say one of the things that we are here to celebrate is the power of the book and what a book can do. So here recently, there's been a discussion in the media in the country of who has kids and who doesn't have children. Very unfortunate. However, I say all of that to say I have 391 children. I don't look like I do, but I have 391 children. And all of those children go to Turner Elementary School in Washington, D.C. And as you know, Washington is divided into quadrants. There are 4 quadrants. These kids live in Southeast Washington, which is the poorest quadrant of Washington D.C., and quickly becoming gentrified. So their zip code is 20032. And I volunteered here with these kids for the last 18 years. And some of these kids do not have the luxury or the opportunities to even leave their zip code. And it's not until they have their weekly visits in their school library. Each class gets to go to the library once a week. And during that time in the library, they get to expand their worlds beyond 2032. And it's my hope that these kids are going to expand their minds and expand their worlds to encompass zip code 57006. And they, right? And they can discover, right? And they can discover that they have so much in common with the children from South Dakota. And one thing that it's been a pleasure for me to do is travel all over the world with Chair Lowe. And we've been I mean, this is the 3rd time I've been in South Dakota, and if in 1 year. And if you would have told me I would be 3 times in South Dakota, I would say you're kidding. But I'm not going to claim South Dakota as my adopted state because I have to go through a blizzard first, and then if I come out the other end, then I'll claim it. But the one thing that happens on all of these travels is we have in this country, we are so much in common. We may do things differently, but underneath it, we're the same. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. And again, thank you, Bobby. So I want to sing the praises of the South Dakota Humanities Council. And again, you guys are fantastic, especially all of you. I'm not going to call names. So South Dakota Humanities Council seeks to celebrate literature, provide or promote civil conversation, and tell stories that define our state. I'm going to claim it, even though I haven't gone through the blizzard yet. Is that okay? Okay. And I heard the East is better than the, nope. Strike. Sorry. Okay. All right. So anyway, South Dakota Humanities leads statewide advocacy for the humanities, working with partners to foster literacy and civic engagement. Their award winners are excellent examples of the mission and vision of the South Dakota Humanities Council. These awards are going to honor the unique spirit of who make lasting contributions to the humanities in South Dakota. Tonight's honorees have presented vibrant programs, hosted diverse events, and provided essential leadership, funding, and partnering to sustain a vibrant cultural landscape in South Dakota. So to help me present the awards for Distinguished Librarian, Individual, and Organization, I turn the microphone back to SDHC Board Chair Bobby Bolin.
Thank you, Tony. So it is an honor for me to get to stand here and deliver these awards. An honor and a gift. Our first nominee is Michaela Neubauer, our 2024 Distinguished Achievement in the Humanities Award Librarian winner. Michaela is the Community Services Coordinator at the Brookings Public Library. With SDHC support, she has hosted various humanities-centered events such as a community intergroup dialogue program and a Native American Heritage Month speaker series. Neubauer is a member of the South Dakota Library Association and is currently pursuing her Master of Library Science degree through Emporia State University. Congratulations, Michaela.
Okay.
Perfect. I think he's got the instruction. Yeah. Sit back. All right. I'm going to go off script just a little bit. I have known this next honoree for longer than I would really care to share with all of you. Our next category is the 2024 Distinguished Achievement in the Humanities Individual Winner. This honoree hardly needs an introduction. As I stopped at the coffee shop this morning to grab a cup of coffee on my way here, I got into the busy coffee shop, and I stood in line behind an older couple, and I watched the lady as she looked around. I watched her as she looked. I watched her as I want to walk. I watched her as the lady looked around the room, and she looked over and she goes, "Oh," she poked her husband. She goes, "There's Sherry DeBoer." And I just smiled to myself and I thought, does everybody know Sherry? Yes, everybody does. I lost my notes. All right. I'm a passionate volunteer of this organization because of Sherry. Her husband, Tom, and I often laugh because you cannot walk across the room with her and not find somebody who knows her. If you have met her, she has become your friend, and she will always stop and listen to a story or a tale that you have to tell. As I sat next to her earlier today in the Susan Power breakout session, it struck me how important this award is. This award is about impact. This is about all of the conversations that we have had over the last 20 years with authors, with poets, with veterans, with Olympians. This award is about impact. These conversations have allowed us to pause and see the world differently. They have pushed us outside of our comfort zones, and for that I am grateful. They have allowed us to see the world differently and to see it through the eyes of others. All of our lives have been changed because we have been introduced to a topic or a subject that is different from what we might normally have thought about. Sherry, this is your legacy. In more than 3 decades at SDHC, Sherry DeBoer did nearly every job in the organization, ultimately serving as the executive director from 2007 through her retirement in 2018. In that position, she led the council to greater financial stability by increasing its endowments and earning nearly $1 million in challenge grants offered by the National Endowment for the Humanities. As the founding director for SDHC's Center for the Book, DeBoer launched the annual South Dakota Festival of the Book, which NEH has described as the jewel in the state's crown. Throughout her tenure, she emphasized the value of civil conversation. Many times she and I had to push that. The importance of divergent voices, which she brought together in this venue and many others across this state, while developing an encyclopedic knowledge of the council history and a vast network of relationships and friends across the state and region. Thank you. Sherry DeBoer. Okay. All right, our final honoree this evening is the 2024 Distinguished Achievement in Humanities Award Organization winner. It was to be here Eric Mucky, and he was not able to be with us here this evening. He represents an organization called Lost and Found that delivers comprehensive, data-driven, and resilience-focused suicide prevention and post-vention program and services for youth and young adults, ages 10 to 34, and their support networks. Lost and Found envisions a world in which no young adult dies by suicide and where tools and support for developing lifelong wellness are easily accessible. With support from SDHC grants, they have used the humanities to share hope and healing through their 30 Days, 30 Stories projects, reaching thousands of people through in-person events and social media, while also yielding insights on the empowering possibilities of storytelling. He could not be with us here this evening, so we will make sure that he receives his award. Let's have another round of applause for the two that are here. And now, I'm going to turn it back over to Tony.
Thank you, Bobby. And now I'd like to welcome Jennifer Widman, Director of the South Dakota Center for the Book at the South Dakota Humanities Council, for a special announcement. Jennifer.
Thank you. I would like the staff to come and join me on stage. And then no matter how much she's going to hate this, I want Bobby to come up and join us on stage. So we have one more very special, very unique, not annual award to present, and it's a very earned and important one. This year has been one of great transition for the South Dakota Humanities Council, with many members of our board of directors, many of them stepping up and spending lots of extra hours supporting our small staff, and we are incredibly grateful. But one board member in particular, who I believe, I don't think she's counting, but she's going to be chair for like 40 more days. She has absolutely, we all agree, gone above and beyond the call of duty to keep the Humanities Council staff and programs going strong. She spent many days in our office, like almost as an honorary staff member. She checked in regularly by email and text. She arranged and ran numerous extra board and committee meetings, and she generally just made sure operations continued smoothly, all while making the mental and physical health of the staff a priority, which was not always an easy task. But here we are. We're good, right? So when things got a little closer to normal, which maybe has changed, but Bobby immediately took on the task of delivering well over 1,000 copies of the 2024 Young Readers One Book to schools around the state, going as far north. Actually, I'm wrong about this, going as far north as Roslyn and going as far west as, I said Eagle Butte, but actually it's Rossholt. Yeah, not Rossland. She went to Eagle Butte and points west to make sure third graders everywhere got their books. And she continues to volunteer for any and every humanities project possible, including the Festival of Books, something she has done since my very first festival in 2012, when she was just this person I met who Sherry said, "This is Bobby, she'll do anything." And she really did. And so, Bobby, the SDHC staff really does appreciate you, and we want to recognize your dedication with this gift. And we're going to take a picture. Oh. All right. Thank you. And now I will turn the microphone over to the South Dakota State Poetry Society for the 2024 Poet of Merit Awards.
Thank you, Jennifer. My name is Dana Yost, and I'm a member of the State Poetry Society Board of Directors, and I am honored to present the Poetry Society's 2024 Posthumous Poet of Merit Award tonight to Adrian C. Lewis. Lewis was born in 1946 and died in 2018. He was an enrolled member of the Lovelock Paiute tribe and earned BA and MA degrees in creative writing from Brown University. He was a poet, journalist, critic, and novelist. He was an editor for the Lakota Times and Indian Country Today. He was the author of 19 books of poetry, and his novel Skins was made into a movie in 2002 starring Graham Greene. His work has won numerous awards, including Pushcart Prizes and Bush Foundation Fellowships. He's been honored and praised by Pulitzer Prize winners and poet laureates of the United States. In addition to his prolific writing, Lewis taught at Oglala Lakota College on the Pine Ridge Reservation and at Southwest Minnesota State University in Marshall for many years. The Poetry Society is pleased to present the 2024 Posthumous Poet of Merit Award to Adrienne Lewis's literary executor, David Pecaski, who will read one of Adrienne's poems.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Adrienne is in this Joy Harjo anthology, the Norton Anthology of Native Nations Poetry. When she's putting that together, I got an email from Joy Harjo. We can't have a Native American anthology without Adrienne Lewis, can we? And so it's kind of important. The poem she picked for here is titled Skinology. And Adrienne was a little rude and crude here. I have some of his books in a box in the back for $1 a box, $1 a book, $1 a book, if you want them. But watch out for what he has to say. Adrienne was always dissatisfied, whether it was Nevada, with his place, with the situation, with his personal life, with the res situation, and in a larger sense with America. That's the way that thing goes. So there's a lot of critique, and you can hear all of those things in Skinology. Okay. Yellow roses, wild roses, they're decades of growth, a fierce fence between the drunkenness of my neighbors and me. I've known some badass skins, cliched bad to the bone Indians who are maybe not bad, but just broke. And broken for sure. Late winter, late night, a gentle rapping, a tapping on my chamber door, some guy selling a block of commodity cheese for $5. You climbed a tree, sat there for hours until some kind of voice called you back home. You unfolded your wings, took to the air, and smashed into earth. They hauled you to the ER, then detox, where they laughed at your broken wings. Once I thought I saw eagles soar, loop and do the crow hop in the blue air while the sun beat the earth like a drum, but I was disheveled and drinking those years. Indians and the internet. Somewhere, sometime, whenever a Messiah chief is born, jealous relatives will drag him down like the old days, only instantly now. In a brutal land, within a brutal land, with corrupt leaders and children killing themselves, we know who's to blame. But we're on a train, a runaway train, and we don't know what to do. The good earth, the sun blazing down on our butts stuck in inner tubes, floating down a mossy green river, speechless, stunned, silent with joy and sobriety and youth and youth. She smiled at me, got off her horse. She smelled of leather and sweat, and her kiss has lasted me 50 years. Bad Indians do not go to hell. They are marched to the molten core of the sun and then beamed back to their families, purified, whole, and holy as hell. That's Adrienne. The Big A, we used to call him. The Big A.
It's a little hard to see with these lights here. Is Lydia here? Oh, please come up, Lydia. read this first. I'll read that.
Okay.
Okay. Now I'm honored to present the 2024 Living Poet of Merit Award to Lydia Whirlwind Soldier. Lydia is an enrolled member of the Sikangu Lakota on the Rosebud Reservation. She is a graduate of Sinte Gleska University and Pennsylvania State University. She is a poet, novelist, essayist, and business owner. She has taught elementary school and has served as Indian Studies Coordinator for the Todd County School District. She's also a skilled craftswoman, and she won a first place prize in the Northern Plains Tribal Arts Exhibition for a traditional cradle board. A founding member of the Oak Lake Tribal Writers Society, Whirlwind Soldier has long been an advocate for Native voices in education. It is our pleasure to present Lydia Whirlwind Soldier with the 2024 Living Poet of Merit Award, and with our thanks for your contribution to South Dakota's literary and artistic landscape. You're welcome. Congratulations.
Okay. All right. It is now my honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Brian Kastner. This evening's program is entitled From Iraq to the Arctic and to the Klondike. Mr. Kastner is a nonfiction writer, former explosive ordnance disposal officer, and veteran of the Iraq War. His most recent book is Stampede, A New History of the 1897 Klondike Gold Rush. Mr. Kastner is also the best-selling author of Disappointment River, All the Ways We Kill and Die, and the war memoir, The Long Walk. His journalism and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Wired, Esquire. I used to work at Esquire back in the day. We'll have to talk. The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, and also on NPR. Please welcome Mr. Kastner.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. I know that there was some movement there were people were moving in and out, so I don't know. There were some folks in the back if they wanted to come in. Now's a good time. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. An extra thank you to Jennifer and everybody at the South Dakota Humanities Council for bringing me here to Brookings. An extra thank you to Rich, who got struck driving. He drove me around for the last day. So thank you to him. It's been a couple of years now since I've been in South Dakota. I'm not sure. I've asked around. I'm not sure anybody knew before I was asked to come. But when I was in the Air Force, my first duty assignment was Ellsworth Air Force Base in Rapid City. And I spent 3 years there. We working on base emergency management, responding to tornadoes and blizzards, plane crash while I was there. I really enjoyed it. I got to do a lot of hunting and fishing and antelope hunting up in Hardin County. Please don't hold it against me that I was a West River person for my time in South Dakota. Anyway, it's good to be back. So I spent a lot of time in the outdoors when I lived here, and I've spent a lot of my life outside as much as I can. And so I want to start by telling a story from a place very different than the plains here. And my story, the one I want to tell very quickly, is from the Adirondack Mountains in northern New York, not far from Lake Placid, which hosted the Winter Olympics. You know, on the plains, a place like here, when I was stationed in New Mexico, it's actually even flatter in eastern New Mexico than it is in eastern South Dakota. And we used to say that you could stand on a tuna can and see the back of your head. So that's here. In the mountains where I live, it's known for steep bare rock and wind and rain and biting black flies and sometimes all those things at once. And so this story is from a couple of years ago. In the Adirondacks, I was on a ridge of mountains called the Santanonis. And I was there with 3 of my sons. My sons were all small at the time. They were all under 10 years old. And we were there to work on the 46. So the 46 in the Adirondacks is the 46 mountains over 4,000 feet. I know that might not sound like much, but when you're starting at 1,000 feet, that's 3,000 feet of elevation for each one of them. And the thing to do in the Adirondacks is to do all of the 46 in your life. And then when you've done them all in the summer, you do them all in the winter. And then there's all these different, lists you can get on. Anyway, we were working on our 46 together. And some of these mountains, some of these 46 are spectacular. And some of them are a slog. And we were in one of the slogs. There's swamps at the bottom of the mountain, but there's also in the Santanonis, there's somehow bogs on the top of the mountain as well. And say that again? Oh, okay. My youngest had already fallen into one of those bogs and he was muddy up to his waist. It was 5 or 6 p.m. We were hungry. We'd been hiking for 12 hours. We had hours left to go and a thunderstorm was rolling in and we were exposed on the top of this mountain. And it's lightning and the rain's going sideways and the wind and we're slipping on the rock trying to get to the summit. And my youngest son, Elijah, and he's probably only 6 or 7 years old at the time, he's the one already half covered in mud. And he slips and he falls and he gets back up and he looks at me and we're on the side of this mountain and the thunderstorm is behind him and he's crying like desperate tears. And he is in pain and he's frustrated and he's probably a little scared. And he looks at me and he screams, "What are we even doing here?" And it's a good question. And when your son gives you that look, you need a better answer than you're climbing the mountain because it's there, right? What are we even doing here? And this is the question that links all of my books. Why are we even on this trip? Why am I in Iraq taking apart these bombs? Why am I canoeing to the Arctic? Why are the Stampeders braving avalanches in Whitewater? What are we even doing? This is the question. And I think the answer can be found in the stories of my books, and not just the details of the story, but the type of stories I write. And it might not be surprising. I mean, we're at a book festival. Writers like to say that the answer to a lot of questions is a story. I get that. Humans, we tell stories to make sense of the world. But I want to break down stories for just a second, if you'll indulge me. Describe how they work, how they do their magic, and how we can answer questions like, what are we even doing on the side of this mountain? So I'm a believer that satisfying stories, the stories that resolve and make you go at the end, like you just ate a good meal. These stories follow one of the 7 basic plots. In this, I'm guided by a book of the same name by Christopher Booker. It was published about 20 years ago. And when I describe these 7 plots, I think you'll recognize them for the archetypes that they are. One of them, the first, is rags to riches. Somebody insignificant becomes a person of great importance. They become rich and powerful. This is Aladdin, this is Cinderella, My Fair Lady, Superman. They all follow this one. Another of the basic stories is rebirth. The protagonist is thought lost or dead or frozen, but through an act of redemption, they're somehow found and become alive again. I mean, that's the Easter story, of course, but it's also in secular literature. It's Snow White, it's Sleeping Beauty, but also A Christmas Carol or The Grinch. And then there's 2 that go together, comedy and tragedy. These are like mirror images of each other. And a comedy is not about humor. It's about a series of complications that somehow resolve happily all at the end in one dramatic reveal. one dramatic event. And Shakespeare's comedies are the classics, of course, but most Hollywood romantic comedies follow this, like Jerry Maguire. And then tragedy is the inverse of comedy, because all those complications resolve, but they resolve in the destruction of the main character through their own flaws, and they learn their life lesson the hard way. So that leaves three more basic plots, and these are the three I really wanted to spend most of our time talking about, because they apply to the kind of war stories and outdoor stories that I tend to write. The first one is slaying the monster, and this is almost self-explanatory. Beowulf, Jaws, every James Bond film ever made, basically. A great evil threatens the hero's home and must be destroyed. The second one is the quest. A hero must travel a long distance in search of an important object. The search for the Grail in King Arthur, Raiders of the Lost Ark, In Search of the Ark, Dante's Inferno. That was a search for something a little bit more existential. But you combine these stories, the slaying the monster and the quest, and you get some of the most popular tales of all time. Not just the Odyssey, but also The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and Trying to Kill Voldemort. This combo, the combination of the quest and defeating the monster, it's what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey in his book, Hero of a Thousand Faces. And quite famously, when George Lucas was writing Star Wars about Luke Skywalker on a quest to slay the Death Star, he used Campbell's work in The Hero of a Thousand Faces as a model. So I just want to pause here on a side note. This really shouldn't be a side note, but a bit of a side note that yes, so many of these kind of tales, slaying the monster and the quest I've talked about, they tend to code male. And it doesn't have to be. There's plenty of examples otherwise. But that's true. There's an equivalent that codes female, so to speak, and is covered extremely well in a book by Maria Tartar, a Harvard professor, which plays off the title of Campbell's, and she calls hers The Heroine with 1,001 Faces. And I love this book. I found it extremely useful and insightful, but it drove me a little nuts too. And that's because she presents all of these examples and facts throughout time, all these common themes when women are the protagonist over stories over thousands of years, without drawing the conclusion that by the end of it seems kind of obvious unites many of the examples. And that's that even 1,000 years ago, many of these stories are detective stories. They're mysteries. And the protagonist, a woman, is in trouble and she needs to discover the truth. And that truth, most often, is that her husband is trying to kill her and is hiding it from her. So the idea of gaslighting goes back a really long way. And there's many fairy tales that follow this formula, some obscure like Bluebeard. In Bluebeard is a serial killer who kills his 6 wives and hangs them in a secret room, and the 7th wife discovers this. But there's other well-known examples like Rumpelstiltskin, if you remember that one, where if you remember, a woman is sold into slavery by her father, is threatened death from the king, and then must save the life of her son by figuring out the name of the imp that is spinning straw into gold. Anyway, I digress, but only a little. So we have quests, we have slaying of monsters, rebirth, rags to riches, comedies and its inverse tragedies, detective stories. I've covered every one of the basic plots except for the one that unites my books. And that final basic plot, the one that I seem to be drawn to subconsciously, is the voyage and return. Now, I'm here tonight to explain why the voyage and return is the most satisfying, the most illuminating, the most useful in the world we live in today, and why you, like me, should appreciate the voyage and return above all others, and why I've been subconsciously writing it, like I said, in this format for over a decade. So let me see if I can take the subconscious and make it explicit. So the voyage and return story is not gendered. It's equal opportunity. The protagonists that are as likely to be women as men or girls as boys in the most famous of these stories. And the voyage and return, it is a journey like the quest a little bit, but it's a very different kind of journey. The protagonist chooses to leave home and enter a world completely unlike their own. They're completely cut off and often trapped in a new place. And at first, this new world is exhilarating, it's exciting, it's invigorating, but eventually they realize that the new world is not what they expected it to be. So be careful what you wish for. And there's a shadow. And so the second half of the story is an escape from that new world back to home. Now, I'm sure you've already thought of many examples that follow this. The Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Jurassic Park. I would also argue that a great deal of war literature and stories about the outdoors, including the 3 books of mine that I'm here to talk about, follow that guide. So my first book was The Long Walk, and its subtitle, I did not intend this as a voyage and return format. The subtitle of that book is A Story of War and the Life That Follows. I was an EOD officer, and I did a couple tours in Iraq in the mid-2000s. And EOD stands for Explosive Ordnance Disposal, so that's the bomb squad. And my book describes that experience, the experience of going to war in Iraq and then coming home. And I want to stress, I volunteered for this, to take apart bombs, go to war. I chose to go on that journey. And like many young people before me, it turns out that war was not what I thought it was going to be. I wanted to disarm IEDs, those improvised explosive devices, roadside bombs, as they were often called at the time, or car bombs. But most often they were hidden so well that we couldn't find them before they blew up. And so we were actually doing post-blast investigations, picking up the pieces afterwards of both the bomb and unfortunately the victims, and then trying to find second or third bombs that would have been hidden that were there to try to kill us when we responded. And so my goal in that book, in The Long Walk, was to always make sure that I got the feeling right. And that feeling was that I had a lot of trauma and I had a lot of struggles coming home. And so the book is weaved together, those 2 stories. The voyage and return are intertwined, my time in Iraq and my time at home. And that felt true to the experience because I did multiple tours. And when I was in Iraq, I felt like I should be home and I wasn't the kind of father or husband that I thought I should be. And then when I was home, then my brothers and sisters that were bomb technicians were in Iraq and were serving and fighting and sometimes dying without me. And a number of things helped my transition home after my time in Iraq. One of them was physical activity. I was a runner. I had never been much of a runner before, but I learned that by going on long runs, 2 miles, 5 miles, 7 miles, 10, 15 miles, the longer I ran, basically, as I put it, one pain to cover the other. Eventually, you're just in so much pain from working your body that I was able to get Iraq out of my head. But I also started paddling whitewater, was the other thing that I started to do. And I liked that both of those, you get a sense of flow. You're locked in what you're doing, and you can only really concentrate on the run. You can only really concentrate on the paddling. And then that gives your brain a rest from all of that Iraq stuff. In the running, it's the pain that does this, but in the whitewater, it's staying alive in a rapid. And this is how I ended up pitching my next book, Disappointment River, which is about Alexander Mackenzie's search for the Northwest Passage. So not about you, but my 4th grade teacher lied to me. And because my 4th grade teacher told me that Lewis and Clark led the first expedition across North America. And that's not true. The person who did it was Alexander Mackenzie, who you probably have never heard of. Now, this is allowing for there may well have been indigenous crossings that were never recorded, but the first one that we know of that was written down was Mackenzie's. So Mackenzie was born in 1762 in Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis in far northern Scotland. He was a refugee to America, and he got to New York City in 1775, not good timing, just as the Revolution was kicking off. And his family fled up the Mohawk River in upstate New York, and then eventually on to Montreal. And in Montreal, he joined the fur trade. And then this is how he would ultimately, it's why he took his great voyage. So Mackenzie made his crossing of North America when Meriwether Lewis was just a schoolboy and Sacagawea had not been born yet. So Mackenzie was doing his exploring in the time of the voyagers, who are paddling these enormous canoes across the northern part of the continent. So for this, I'm just going to have to explain a little bit, to make sense, have to explain a little bit of how the fur trade worked. So you would have these fur traders at these interior posts throughout North America, mostly in the north. I'll get to that. But they would trade with local indigenous people for the beaver fur. They would trade, gunpowder or pots or clothing or textiles or all these different things. And then they would take those furs, they would have to ship them to London. And then in London, they would be processed. And then they were shipped again all the way around the southern part of South America to China. And then from China, the payment would go back to London and then would eventually make it back to the traders and would make it back with more pots and pans and other sorts of things to trade. It would take 2 or 3 years for all of that trade and movement to happen. And so, from a business perspective, there was great incentive to try to figure out a way to shorten that trip. And the way that they decided to shorten that trip is they became convinced that there must be a Northwest Passage. And so these voyagers in these canoes, these massive canoes, paddling 18 hours a day, take 100 miles in a day, they would run the portages with the goods on their back. And these canoes were going from Montreal across Canada into the Great Lakes, into what's now South Dakota, Minnesota. At Voyager National Park is obviously at the Grand Portage is where they would take out. And then they would go always further up north and west into what was, at that time, they had not mapped out. They did not know what was in that part of the map. And Mackenzie worked for the Northwest Company, which was kind of the rival of the Hudson's Bay Company. And so the rule for hundreds of years, since Cartier and Champlain, since the 15 and 1600s, was that the best furs were always further north and further west, because the best beaver fur happens at the height of winter. They would call that the Coster Gras. It's when the beavers need the most fur, obviously, to keep out the winter chill. So that's when they would try. That's when they would try to hunt the beaver and get the skins. But it also meant the colder it was, the better the beaver fur. And so the Northwest Company had a series of posts, always going further north and west. And so Mackenzie, looking for this Northwest Passage, in the summer of 1789, 13 people in 3 canoes left for Chipewyan, which is on Lake Athabasca, it's a 2-day drive north of here. And these people left to try to find, there was rumors of a great river that was flowing to the west, really far north. And so Mackenzie's partner was Aguinaldo, and Aguinaldo was a Chipewyan trading chief, and he deserves to be at least as famous as Sacagawea. He was really the great North American explorer of the 18th century. And then Mackenzie also had 4 voyagers to paddle with him. He had a German clerk who was a Hessian mercenary who fought in the American Revolution and deserted. And then Aguinaldo brought 2 of his hunters, one of which was his younger brother. And Aguinaldo also brought 2 of his wives, and 2 of the voyagers brought their wives. And this wasn't for company. This was really ruthlessly communitarian. While men were hunting and paddling, women were cooking. The division of labor was extremely, separated between men and women at that time. And so they paddle, they leave Great Slave Lake on this massive river. They're heading west. They think they continue to head west. There's terrible weather. There's thunderstorms. They can't take good compass readings. Well, their compass is pointing off in the wrong direction. They don't know that. They can't take good readings of the sun. It takes them 40 days, but they get to an ocean, but it's the wrong ocean. Because we know now that river makes a hard right turn at the Canadian Rockies, and it goes north. It doesn't go to the Pacific. It goes to the Arctic. And so when Mackenzie gets to the end in July of 1789, he finds the way completely covered in pack ice, which is why he names it the River Disappointment. And that became the title of my book, Disappointment River. And the subtitle, again with that voyage and return idea, Finding and Losing the Northwest Passage. Mackenzie chose to take the voyage, but it's not what he thought it would be. Which leads us to the third book of mine I want to talk about, which is Stampede. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1897, if people think about it at all, it's sugar-coated, literally in the form of a Klondike ice cream bar, right? Like that's the word and the thing that has survived. But it's not an ice cream bar. It's not a get-rich story as it's sometimes portrayed. It's a disaster movie. So this was the end of the Gilded Age. And after the Great Panic of 1893, America was in the worst economic depression in the nation's history to that point. And then in the newspapers, there start to be these reports of gold discovered in Alaska. In fact, the newspapers say that there's millions of dollars of gold nuggets laying in plain sight upon the ground like Easter eggs. The answer to everyone's economic woes is literally on the front page of the paper. And so 100,000 people end up going on the Stampede in 1897. That is equivalent at the time to the combined population of Los Angeles and Seattle. And this is average people from cities. This isn't like people that were settling the prairie. These are not ranchers or farmers, people that knew how to endure the weather. These are city people, and they endured every sort of calamity. And many of them showed up in like leather shoes and suits, and like absolutely, completely unprepared. So they faced shipwrecks, avalanches, scurvy, famine, drowning in the rapids of the Yukon River. We actually still have no idea how many died. If you just add up the number of people lost in the rolls of the shipwrecks that we know of on the Pacific coast, you get to over 10,000. In fact, I was trying at one point to really try to piece together if we could get an estimate. And the only place any of the people that died were ever recognized was in their hometown newspaper. And so, like, whatever the local newspaper of Brookings would have been at the time might have said, these two people died, in Alaska this summer. But you would literally need somebody to read all the obituaries of all the local papers across America for that summer to have any sense of how many people it was. Only a third of those 100,000 people that took the journey actually made it to Dawson City, to the Klondike. And of those, almost none got rich. So they took the voyage and they did not find what they thought. They found something else. Now, there are a number of details that link these stories. And as a veteran, I think I noticed some details that maybe other people don't, things that other researchers or writers might pass by. For example, I think it's interesting that a lot of the fur traders in the far Northwest were veterans of the French and Indian War. And in fact, many of them served on opposite sides of the French and Indian War. And now they have to spend all winter at an outpost together trading. There were more than a few killings and murders and fights and everything else from those former veterans or former soldiers fighting. It's also true that a lot of the people that went, some of the older men that went on the Klondike Gold Rush were veterans of the Civil War. And in fact, the gold rush at that time was seen by some as the last West. Alaska was the last frontier. I mean, some people still call it that. And a lot of the violence and a lot of the history of the settlement of the West has to do with the fact that it was Civil War veterans that were doing a lot of that. I don't mean to digress into that, but what also links these stories besides these details, taking apart bombs in Iraq, Mackenzie's voyage, the Klondike Stampede, is, like I say, they're all voyage and return. For Mackenzie, for the majority of those that went on the Stampede, and for many of the veterans of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the feelings about these journeys can be a little complicated. And it's worth saying, complicated feelings about these journeys, that's not the popular narrative, right? So war stories, outdoor stories, they often fall into two main camps. The quest and the slaying of the monster on one hand, and then this voyage and return on the other. Now, there's plenty of, similarities superficially. There can be long journeys. There's often a training montage, so like Rocky, that's slaying the monster, of course. There are plenty of examples of war movies that adhere to that quest and slaying the monster formulas. The Dirty Dozen slays the monster. Saving Private Ryan is the quest narrative, of course. And then in war books, there are literally no end of slaying the monster narratives. Think, for example, about No Easy Day, about the killing of bin Laden. And then in the outdoors, I mentioned Mackenzie, a lot less famous than Lewis and Clark. Well, Lewis and Clark on their quest, they opened the West, right? They're credited for starting settlement in the West in the United States. They succeeded. In the reality shows of today, lots of Yukon gold miners take a long journey and then they strike it rich. It makes for good TV. It's popular. No Easy Day was the #1 bestseller for weeks on the New York Times list. And so some of us really are the hero of our own stories. And if that's you, congratulations. But for every Saving Private Ryan, there's also a Thin Red Line, which I would count as the best war movie of all time. And it's the voyage and return model. And I think the voyage and return is the more common human experience, and it has more to teach us about how to live our lives. Because this is the key bit. The reason that these 7 plots, these 7 story arcs, have endured for thousands of years is because they're satisfying to us humans in a way that's hard to put into words. They feel complete. It's like when a song ends on a major chord of the key. It comes together in a way that words don't fully explain. It ends as it should. And a lot of modern literature is unsatisfying because it doesn't end this way. And you'll hear a lot of novelists, and I don't know if there were any at the festival that said this, so sorry, but you'll hear a lot of novelists say that when they begin a book, they don't know how it's going to end. And this has never made sense to me because all my books, all my short stories, all my magazine pieces, I always write the ending first. If you don't know where you're going, how do you get there? I mean, I wrote the end of this talk first, and then I have to figure out how we're going to get there. And you don't know where you're going, you end up with a lot of modern literature, and then the author is stuck. They've written so far into the book, and they don't know what to do. And so then they do a couple strategies. They kill everybody. Or they leave the ending unresolved in a way that feels edgy and like interesting. It just stops. Or the story starts again at the beginning, and it makes a virtue of the fact that it starts again at the beginning. But when stories end this way, it almost never feels right. Take the ending of The Sopranos, for instance. Yes, people die. We know this. Killing off characters doesn't teach us anything. And we know that life doesn't just stop. The world doesn't just stop. It goes on and on and on. And so an arbitrary cutoff doesn't actually teach us things. And we also know that life doesn't exactly repeat either. You're a different person when you've had an experience. You can never step in the same river twice. And so a story that ends as it begins, it's not really true to life. And I think this is that insight of the voyage and return story. As I said a moment ago, the point of this archetype is that they teach us something about life, teaches us a way to live, it teaches us values about what's important. And the point of the voyage is to come back transformed, to have learned something about life from the voyage. The protagonist is different after the experience, and so deals with coming home in a new way. So for Mackenzie, he was frustrated. He gets back, he writes a letter to his cousin Roderick, who's also in the fur trade, and he calls it the River of Disappointment. And so before that 1789 voyage to the Arctic, he was brash and confident. He was a young up-and-comer. He wanted everything he tried. He was one of the youngest bourgeoisie. That was their name for the kind of people in charge of the fur trade as opposed to the voyagers. He was rising through the ranks. After this trip, Mackenzie is a changed man. He returns frustrated and he's driven in a really unhealthy way. And so in 1793, he does a second trip. And that one is the one that succeeds in reaching the Pacific Ocean, like I said, a decade before Lewis and Clark. But he took a path that no one could follow. Like I said, he was looking for the Northwest Passage out of business considerations. They wanted to figure out a way to get thousands and thousands of furs to China. And a way to do that is not through a narrow pass in the Canadian Rockies that was steep and dangerous. And after this second trip, he returned to Montreal. He tried to be a politician. He failed, and he essentially drank himself to death. He was changed, but not for the better. In the Klondike, at the end of the stampede, many people simply went home. And one surprising thing to me is that the vast majority of people who made it, like I said, only a third did make it, but the vast majority that did, they never even tried looking for gold. They said they had a great adventure and they returned to their lives. One of those stampeders that did that was a young man named Jack London. Now, at that point in his life, London was a ne'er-do-well oyster pirate from San Francisco, and he had worked as a child. He'd worked in child labor in pickle jar factories and a bobbin factory. And he tried to look for gold when he was up there, but he basically failed. He got terrible scurvy. His leg retracted into his body so far he couldn't walk. In desperation, one of his compatriots, one of the people he was with, they broke down their cabin. They took it apart, make a raft out of it, and they floated down the river in the spring to Dawson City, where they fed London potatoes until he got rid of the scurvy and recovered. And then he sailed home down the Yukon with $5 in his pocket, $5 worth of gold. But from having made that journey, obviously he came back with stories that would become Call to the Wild and Seawolf and White Fang and To Build a Fire. He made his fortune from the change and for what he learned on the journey. Now, in Iraq, I wasn't just changed by my war experience, I was hijacked by it. We never slayed the monster. We never completed the quest. We went and found something we didn't expect. Very rarely, like I said, were we the ones taking apart the IED. Very rarely, do we come home at the end of the day, having found what we were looking for, destroyed it, and come back. Now, over the years, readers have gotten a hold of me about the long walk, and I thought I was writing it as a warning. And it took me a long time to realize that many young people read it as a how-to manual. But there's a long history of graybeards warning that the youth that war isn't what they expect it to be. And I know I won't be the last one there. In war, you learn about your own mortality at a very young age. I had my midlife crisis in my 20s. There can be value in this. You learn much earlier in your life what to prioritize, how to spend time in your life, hopefully, spend time with your family, spend your life with gratitude. You can change that post-traumatic stress into post-traumatic growth. So you must be changed by the experience. That's what makes the journey worth it. This warning is in the traditional stories as well. Think back again to Alice in Wonderland. Alice goes off. She has this experience with the Cheshire Cat and the Mad Hatter and the Queen of Hearts and everybody else. And when she gets back, she wakes up and she says, "What a funny dream." And that's it. She's unchanged. She failed the test. Dorothy, though, in Wizard of Oz, she learns a lesson about Kansas, doesn't she? That the people around her in her own backyard are more valuable than she realized before the journey. She's grounded and grateful. She's matured. She passes the test. This is the lesson for our life, to grow with the journey. In many war stories that follow that slay the monster formula, the hero is unchanged. Grendel is the same person before and after. I'm sorry, Beowulf is the same person before and after he rips off Grendel's arm. The SEAL that kills bin Laden is a badass before he does it, and he's a badass afterwards. The hero is successful, but the same. And this is why I'm drawn to that voyage and return archetype, because that doesn't resonate with my own war experience, nor of the people I write about, nor even of my own trip to the Arctic, because in 2016, I retraced Mackenzie's journey, 1,200 miles from Great Slave Lake to the Arctic Ocean. It also took me 40 days. It felt biblical. In the outdoors, you learn the value of civilization. You appreciate it. I don't know how many people read Sigurd Olson, if you've heard that name before. Sigurd Olson, he's a very famous Minnesota writer, not far from here. He writes about canoeing and he writes about the outdoors. His books used to resonate with me and they don't anymore. And the reason is because he makes a virtue of what I would call meaningless self-imposed suffering. It's a fake version of the simple life. Yes, a simple life is great. I love a simple life, but a legit one, not the temporary fake one on a canoe trip. You can't live your whole life at a canoe camp. Make your home before you leave. Make that simple and peaceful. This is what I learned on the Mackenzie journey. 40 days on the water, I was left with nothing left to prove by the end of that. I'd always wanted to take a long journey. And you get to the very last island. Mackenzie makes it, he called it Whale Island. Now it's called Gary Island. It's the last island in the Delta. And you've basically got the brown water of the river on one side and the gray of the Arctic Ocean on the other. And we're on this island and we had worked so hard to get there. I was in tears by the end of that trip. And then I look on the beach and there's bear tracks. The place that I had worked so hard to get to was a bear's home. Like it was wherever you go, there you are, right? And that bear lived his whole life, or his or her whole life, in the place I had tried so hard to get to. That's what taught me something. So let me leave you with this last thought. It's a bit of a wrinkle we haven't talked about yet. And that's that all of 3 of my books that I'm talking about tonight are nonfiction. They're true. I didn't make them up. I didn't change things to make a better voyage and return archetype. I think this is a feature of stories. It's not a bug. It says something about their nature. There's an iterative circular process here. Humans have experiences. They tell a factual version of the story. Over time, it becomes fictional or adapted, and then it teaches us a lesson and it gets fed in again. But it starts with people having experiences for real that then get recycled as those stories. So the next time you find yourself on a mountain with a child asking you, what are we even doing here? Whether that's figurative or literal, and your 6-year-old looks up at you, I hope you have a better answer as well than because it's here. When we take the voyages in our lives and they don't turn out like we expect, the challenge is to allow ourselves to be changed by the experience and to live our lives anew. Thank you. Yes, we do have a minute for questions. I was at Ellsworth 2000 to 2003. I showed up in March of 2000 and then February of '03 is when I left. Okay. It's where it was so formative. It's where we didn't have our first kids there. Kind of made the first kids there. The my wife had her first nursing job at Rapid City Regional Hospital. It was a really good place for us. Yes, sir.
Were you an author before you went to Iraq? Or did you go, after you came back from Iraq, did you have some things in you that you had to get out that made you an author? And if I missed that, I
No, you didn't miss it. So that's a good question. I had always wanted to be a writer. I was telling the veterans group today at the veterans workshop that I popped in with Amber. You know, I had always wanted to be a writer growing up, but I didn't know writers. I didn't know being a writer was something you could do. Like, I did not know that that was a thing that people today, I just did not have any overlap with my parents' friends or with people that I knew or whatever else. So I had, uh, scribbled things and kept journals and all that kind of stuff, but was very practical, went into the military and, got an engineering degree instead. And it was only after, my time in Iraq. And then when I came home, I was a contractor for a while. I was teaching for a couple of years there. I and my team taught every single bomb tech in the U.S. military before they went to Iraq or Afghanistan, during the surges in both countries. So it was, in the midst of that, when I was having lots of post-traumatic stress troubles and lots of, challenges dealing with that and traumatic brain injury and all those other things, that's when I finally said, you know what, maybe I have a story other people would want to read. I'm going to take the time and take this seriously and write a book. And that's what became The Long Walk. So I was not a writer before. It was, and I was really fortunate. My first book did well. And then when your first book does well, you kind of get to keep going a little bit, as long as at least editors will answer your email afterwards. So, and have been able to keep with it. I feel fortunate. Yes, sir.
all that you have as you work through that first book. Yeah.
Yeah. So what kind of support did I have writing the first book? I have an incredible wife that had health insurance, um, to pay. I mean, that's not a small thing for a writer. And but I didn't have a community yet. So I wrote the book really as a very solo endeavor, gave it to a few friends that were not necessarily writers, but were good readers. Um, and then I just got lucky. I found a guy on Twitter recommended his agent. That's still my agent today. I was fortunate that I wrote an Iraq war memoir at exactly the time publishers were looking for Iraq war memoirs. And so it was only after I became a writer that I learned what it meant or felt like, or like the community wise, like the business, like I finished a book and didn't even know that you got an agent and then an editor. Like I didn't understand any of that. So I would say that my support from a craft perspective or from a writing perspective was, reading books like On Writing by Stephen King. It's a classic of the craft book for a reason, but like reading other people's story, other writers' stories, just about like how many words a day do you write and when do you write, in the morning or the afternoon? And the answer is, of course, just do whatever works for you. But um, I was looking at those examples and then I read a ton. And so I really believe that if there's kind of a garbage in, garbage out. I personally, and I know many writers are like this, you have to be careful what you're reading when you're writing because it's just, you can't help it. It just comes out of your pores. And so, um, really feasting on a diet of good literature while you're trying to produce it, I think is important. And that's that support is helpful, both inspirational and just on a sentence level. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, right. For the Iraq adventure in general, yeah, I have trouble. It's a worthy question. It's a good question. It's the right question. I personally have trouble separating that question from the very personal experience of trying to keep people alive and, having lost friends there. I don't know how to separate those two. I guess I could give you like a very analytical, political answer about how, like, well, I was in the military and I saw, we all like the basic intelligence said Saddam had WMDs, and that was like everybody thought that, and everybody got it wrong, and we toppled the Taliban so quickly. Why, it made sense, and I could, it was reasonable to believe at the time. I could give lots of answers of those things, and then we should have done this, we should have done that, debathification. Like there's a million technical. I don't know that none of those answers feel genuine. Um, in hindsight, I guess I would just say that in hindsight, having four sons, I think about this a lot and about not doing it again. So, and not just my sons, of course, other people's sons and daughters. I think hard about that. If I were a one issue voter, that would be my one issue that I would vote on. I guess I'm a voter, but not a one issue voter. Everyone should vote. I didn't answer your question. I'm sorry about that. Okay, one more, and then we'll free you. Yes, and if you have ins with any, no, I have finished a novel that my agent is just starting to try to sell. It is, what do I want to say about it? I have not talked about it at all because in the writing process, I was afraid that if I talked about it, I would break it and I would like not, I would lose the headspace of what it is. But I guess now that it's done, I can't mess it up. So it's a novel about, so a conversation that bomb techs often have is the how would you do it conversation. And the how would you do it is how would you rob a bank? Because you eventually realize that between your knowledge of explosives and all these tools, you know how to rob a bank. And so it's the kind of conversation you have after a couple whiskeys. And then you say, like, you know what, we really shouldn't be talking about robbing a bank, but everyone has had it. And so I wrote a novel about having that conversation and what had to happen before and what happens afterwards that you actually do it. And what would be, how low would you have to get to consider that to be your best choice? And then how badly would it go? And speaking of the 7 plots and the 7 basic plots, I wrote it very strictly as a tragedy, 5 acts, like the Macbeth structure, self-destruction at the end. So that is also not a popular genre. Most bank robbery stories are thrillers and the good guys win, and it's not self-destruction at the end. So yeah, if you know any editors for my agent to contact that would like a bank robbery tragedy, we're in the market. So anyway, thank you so much for your patience and for listening. It's been my pleasure.